What is up? Kerry Connick here today, and today we're going to talk about Bob Lazar, Area 51, and flying saucers. Ooh, aliens. So I've personally been interested in like UFOs and aliens for a pretty long time. There was a time where I didn't believe in all that kind of stuff. But today I have a pretty strong belief in aliens existing. So I'm a little on the fence on about like UFOs visiting here and stuff. But if you're anything like me and you have an interest in this subject, then you will most likely know who Bob Lazar is. But if you don't know who Bob Lazar is, then definitely stick around to find out, because he is definitely one of the more intriguing people around the UFO story, alien story kind of thing, because he has claims of working at Area 51 back in the 80s, and he just all around has one of the more believable stories around the UFO subject. You know, like most people you see in videos or anything around the UFO subject are pretty fucking bonkers. And most of them seem like they are just looking for attention for the most part. But Bob Lazar is different in a lot of aspects, in the way of like, he seems pretty genuine when he talks about this stuff. And he even talks about how he doesn't even really like getting the attention from this. He just thinks that it's like a crime against humanity for governments to have hold of any kind of like super technology. He thinks like it's wrong for a government to hold that kind of information from scientists for one, and to the people of the public for two. So I would agree with that as well, because that's pretty deep shit that I think everyone should know, at least if it exists and if it's all real. For sure, I definitely believe people should know about it. But I'm talking about this today because he was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, like less than a week ago. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and back in December there was a movie based around all of his story and everything, all the claims that he made, that came out on Netflix, and it's called Bob Lazar, Area 51, and Flying Saucers, and it was directed by a guy named Jeremy Corbell. And Bob Lazar and Jeremy Corbell were both on Joe Rogan's podcast like sometime in the past couple of days. It's definitely on my top of the list as one of Joe Rogan's more interesting podcasts. And if you watch the podcast, you can see Joe Rogan in the podcast. He is just like for sure like on his game, like at least for the first hour and a half or so. But the podcast was kind of short compared to the rest of Joe Rogan's podcast. It was like a 2-hour podcast when his average is about 3 hours. That's like a standard podcast. And he has the occasional podcast that'll go for like 4 or 5 hours with people like Alex Jones, which is kind of upsetting that Bob Lazar doesn't get like that kind of limelight, but it's understandable. But the podcast is about 2 hours, and it's really intriguing. I've watched both the podcast and the movie that was released around Bob Lazar, the Netflix movie. The Netflix movie Bob Lazar, Area 51, and Flying Saucers was pretty informative, but I personally found Joe Rogan's podcast to be a little more informative. In the movie, I found myself distracted and kind of annoyed with a lot of the editing, as far as like echoes and reverbs, and just they try to make it all dramatic and all this kind of stuff, and I'm not really looking for that out of a documentary or like when I'm trying to learn something. So I would personally recommend watching the Joe Rogan podcast, because it's a little more informative and less distracting as far as the information that is being given. Although the movie was really interesting, and there were definitely some things in the movie that you don't get out of the podcast. There were information about like the FBI and like Bob Lazar being shot at and stuff like that in the movie that didn't get mentioned in the podcast. So if you're really interested in the subject, I definitely recommend both. But let's dive into who Bob Lazar is and what his claims are. So, Bob Lazar is a scientist who claims to have worked in a sub-area of Area 51, a place called S4, where he was reverse engineering parts of alien spacecrafts that were in the hands of the government. And everyone knows the story of Area 51 and like the rumors around it, how that's the place where alien spacecraft have been held for a really long time, even back to like Roswell. But for anyone who makes these kinds of claims, there's always going to be a lot of backlash, a lot of people that are just going to call bullshit. And you know, I'm still not 100% convinced of his story, but there are definitely a lot of parts to his story that makes it a little more reliable than a lot of other sources that you hear. And some of the things I'm talking about are things like element 115, and he mentioned element 115 like back in the 80s or 90s, and how this was the fuel system for these UFOs. And back then everyone called bullshit and, you know, didn't believe him, and years later the government actually released an element called 115, which kind of backs his story of it existing. So that's one thing that kind of backs his story, which he claims there's a difference in the element 115 that was released to the public and the element 115 that he was working on. He was saying that the element 115 that was released to the public is an unstable version of it, and the element 115 that he was working on was a stabilized version of it. And I'm no scientist, I can't tell you anything about the element or the periodic table or anything like that, but when claims like this come forward, it is pretty compelling to listen into what he has to say a little more. Another one of his claims that came forward to be true was that back when he came forward with his story, he mentioned there being this hand scanner thing that was in all of these secret facilities that measured the length of your bones through a light and some kind of scanner. And people back then, of course, like, called bullshit, said it was all fake, said he was making up stories. And yet again, another similar situation happened where years down the road the government released information about this actually existing, so it's another claim that turns out to be true. They released pictures of it and, you know, explained what it did, and it was exactly what Bob Lazar said it was and what it did. So when things like that happens, it definitely makes his story more intriguing. So what information did he learn about how these UFOs worked and where they came from? Well, if you watch the movies or the podcast, you'll see that he didn't really learn much. He was saying that a lot of the stuff was just too far beyond where we are in technology to get anything. And he also said that when you're working in this situation, that you're not allowed to really like talk about your information with other scientists that are working in the same facility. He claims to have had one partner that he could work with and share information with, a guy named Barry, and that was basically how it worked. Only them two could share information on their specific project that they were working on. So the information he has about what these things are and how they work are very limited, although there are some really cool things that he does know and he is able to say. Like, he says that these UFOs basically use an anti-gravity kind of a technology to move through space, which would make sense with any kind of UFO videos. If you've ever seen any of them, they kind of move in kind of crazy ways that defy the laws of physics. And the way he says it works is it creates a distortion in space and time where it ripples space and time and you can move forward. He described an example being like, say if you put a bowling ball on a bed and you stood in front of that bowling ball, it would move forward. He said that's kind of how the anti-gravity worked, and that's how they could reach these crazy speeds that defy the laws of physics. And he also said the technology basically made a force field around the whole entire UFO. So he said, like, if it was on, you couldn't touch it. He said it worked like a magnet, like two magnets pushing away from each other. So as if your hand tried to go forward to it, it would like get pushed away or pushed off, which is really intriguing because that's definitely not any kind of technology we have right now, and it would change a lot of things. That would be like basically a force field. That would be a shield that could be used for a lot of different stuff. Specifically, I think with the way our world works, it would be used in military grade type of weaponry, and technology like that could, push away bullets that were being shot at you or anything like that. So it'd be some pretty intense armor for sure. And he also claims to have seen these flying saucers fly. He said he knew the testing schedules for when they were going to fly them, which he said was on Wednesdays. And one story he mentions was that when he was watching one of these test flights, there was this military guy using like a radio to whoever was inside of the UFO and communicating with them through there, which he also mentioned that doesn't really make sense to the way that technology worked and how radio waves worked. With the force field that he mentioned, he said that shouldn't have been possible for them to communicate through radio waves because the force field should have like bounced it off of it and gone anywhere. But he said that the radios made their way through and worked somehow. So that's some pretty sophisticated technology for sure. It's definitely something we don't have around right now at all, at least not to the public that we know of. Bob Lazar says even any technology that would be hidden from the public, it's not going to come near close to any of this kind of technology. It's just way far beyond where we are in our technological development. Which I could believe that if the story is true. I mean, that definitely seems like something we're not even close to. But yeah, more into the story of Bob Lazar. He says that he got released from this project at S4 because he said that him, his wife, and a friend, I believe, would go on to the area when these test flights would happen. I'm assuming that he wasn't working at the time, of course. But he claims that like on their third time going to watch these test flights, that they got caught, and he basically was brought into a briefing and was released and had his life threatened and his wife's life threatened and all of this stuff, which he also claims is part of his reasonings for opening up about this stuff and going public with it. He looked at it as like an insurance to stay alive, which would make sense because if you had your life threatened, you're gonna do something to try to stay alive, and you know, if any of these claims are true and you die afterwards, it's definitely gonna look fishy on the government's part for trying to hide stuff, because you go public with some information like that and say that your life was threatened and then you die, it's not gonna look good for the government. And he said that the government tried to erase parts of his history, like he at one point worked at Los Alamos and went to a school, which his schooling records cannot be found at all, and the records of him working at Alamos can't really be found, but there was someone who done some digging and found records of his name being on a roster at Los Alamos. I think he said it was on like a phone book or something, and the government claims that Robert Lazar, which is his actual name, Bob Lazar, Robert Lazar, this person who done some digging found his name on a roster in exactly where he said it would be, and the government disclaims this even to this day. Another claim that he made about where at least one of these UFOs, he claimed there was like 9 UFOs at this S4 facility, and he claimed that one of them was at least found through an archaeological dig, which would implicate that these things have been here for at least hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of years watching us. Which I think that would be pretty cool if that's true, because like I'm not really into the ancient alien theory that much, but that would kind of solidify some of the theories over there a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's basically who Bob Lazar and what this whole story is, and you know, it's really intriguing, and it's even more intriguing if you're aware of the Pentagon release of their UFO studies that they did for a while. It's kind of funny that the government has denied even like looking into this for like over 50 years, and then like a year or so ago they are just like up and out like, hey, we've had a whole program for this where we have been studying these things and we have seen weird things, which kind of backs the story of maybe they have been here. I'm definitely, even after all of these releases, still a little bit on that, I don't know. Which, if you are aware of the Pentagon releases of the UFO videos that they have released, it kind of backs Bob's story even more, which is pretty interesting simply because they have denied it for so long, and you know, they've actually released footage of these things now. I will say the Pentagon release has backed my opinion on maybe they have been here more than any other claim out there at all, for sure. Because it's the government finally officially saying that, hey, these things are kind of real and we've kind of been looking into them. I'm definitely still on the iffy side of if they've been around or not, because, you know, the government has been known to release things or make a big news story out of something to, like, persuade or, like, turn an eye to something else they are doing. So it could be complete bullshit so that they can get away with some other dumb shit they're trying to do like they always are. But yeah, that'll be it for this one. Let me know you guys' opinions. Do you guys believe in UFOs? Do you believe in Bob Lazar's story? Do you believe in aliens? Do you think UFOs have been here? Do you think they've not been here? Do you not believe any of it at all? You think it's all bullshit? Let me know down in the comments section. And yeah, that'll be it for this one. Hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.